He was great fun. And the surprising thing I remember was I had no idea what food I was going to get. I wondered, am I going to get some sort of Palace Michelin meal served to me or something? In fact, we had black pudding with some simple vegetables, something like peas and mashed potatoes, which summed up the informality of the whole thing. And that was the encounters I had with him, and they were no more than that. Firstly, made me realise he was naturally nice, relaxed, real human being. I can't believe anybody could meet him and take a dislike to him. And he had an incurable sense of humour. He got him into trouble sometimes publicly because his sense of humour wasn't always politically correct.
Well, I think one of the amazing legacies is that we work in partnership with, and it's a testament that, 65 years after it's founded.
And so he had to find something that was apolitical, and what's more, recruited lots of other royal people over Europe. Come along, let's got something important to do. And they all did.
And speaking out on issues which feel very modern now,
yes.
In the 21st century, speaking out on population growth and its impact on the environment. What are your reflections on the sort of issues that he was putting on the table, given that you've echoed them so brilliantly through your own career?
When it was very encouraging that someone right at the top of like that was taking these issues, which back in the 50s and 60s weren't exactly in the forefront of people's minds. Taking on the population issue was a very courageous thing for him to do, because that's verging on the political.
Especially in the 60s.
Yes, absolutely. And he plunged into that. And he made made others get on with it too. I mean, he instructed, he told me that he wished me to give a lecture on population. A tough little prescription. And of course, if he said that, you had to do it, and you had to do it properly.
There was a tension there, though, wasn't there? And it's something which is still raised in terms of a question about the royal family. And this is a man who also loved to hunt. He was photographed on a big game hunt that had shot a tiger, for example. I mean, there is a clear contradiction in many people's minds about that.
What one has to imagine is that one of the reasons that people liked big game hunting and liked shooting wasn't because it was the wild. They loved the wild. They were expert trackers. They understood about animal behaviour, and they took a realistic view of what the natural world is like in terms of life and death, and of animals hunting one another, and human beings are animals and they're also hunting. So that the early hunters in the empire, as it then was, were the first conservationists, and they founded the first conservation movements long before the World Wildlife Fund.
Did he give you feedback on your own programmes about the natural world? What sort of conversations did you have with him around that?
He looked at it with the eye of a knowledgeable naturalist, and he would recognise, I love that sequence about such and such, and it would be something that wasn't obvious, that was tricky to have got, and that he knew.
Is that the sense that you had of this character, that there was a sort of intellectual rigour about everything that he engaged with?
Very much so. He looked at natural history programming, and there's no doubt about that. And he looked at it with an expert eye.
What did you think when you saw the Duke step back from public life?
Well, I suppose I thought everybody has to do that sometime or other. I was sorry he did it, of course, because while there are people older than oneself, you thought, well, if they keep going, I can keep going. But in a sense, that, again, he was very pragmatic. I mean, he made judgments, and he didn't go by convention. And if he decided that he wasn't doing the job in the way that he wished it to be done, he wouldn't have dragged on, he would have resigned, which of course is what he did.
What's his legacy to this country, do you think?
Well, strangely, I mean, there seems to be no doubt that the royal family still hold a very important place in British society. And many other societies, they have become outmoded and disregarded and, as it were, dismissed and become little more than kind of ornaments. That is not the case in this country. And one of the reasons it is not the case is because royalty in an indefinable way has modernised itself without, and this is the trick, without actually becoming irrelevant. In that evolutionary process, the Duke of Edinburgh played a very, very important part.
You get a sense from your interview there that those are two men who have a deep respect for each other.
Yeah, it was amazing. Just to interview Sir David Attenborough is reward enough, to be honest, because he's obviously such an extraordinary character. But what struck me about it was there were so many parallels there. These were two lives of public service in different ways that had these moments where they were very similar. You know, they'd both been in the Navy, they'd both of that generation, and they both have that self-effacement that Selina was talking about earlier, but an absolute dedication to rigour, intellectual rigour, and getting to grips with subjects and trying to effect practical change. And I think that was something that was really struck me from that interview, is the similarities, and of course, and both utterly devoted, of course, to Her Majesty the Queen, because we saw Sir David make that beautiful film in the Queen's Garden as well. So there's this amazing connection there, and I thought that he sort of touched on that rather beautifully, actually. And I think we're going to hear now from somebody else of whom I'm very fond, and that is Sir Trevor MacDonald, who met the Duke on a number of occasions.
Doing it is because I see the huge value of it, and I still have very fond memories of
gregarious and welcoming to these foreigners. And there's also such an interesting bit in President Obama's statement, Clive, where he said Prince Philip showed the world what it meant to be a supportive husband to a powerful woman. So how he was actually a symbol of modernity in those 73 years that he was the consort to Elizabeth.
Indeed, and all those leaders, they understood that he was an integral part of what the royal family is, as much as the Queen, to a degree. He was by her side for such a long time. He was an ear that she could whisper in. And they understood that. All world leaders understood.
He had carried out more than 22,200 engagements during his long career of public service. Fittingly, his last as Captain General of the Royal Marines. All were aware of the significance of the event. They sang, "For he's a jolly good fellow."
Servants the world over paying their tribute to an exceptional public servant. And what's been interesting about the statements that have poured in since that announcement at lunchtime is the variety of different ways that clearly people appreciated how he served his country. You had Boris Johnson talking about his ethic of service imbued in the days of the Second World War. You had Theresa May talking about how the Commonwealth was so important to him and them to him, and his importance as a consort to the Queen. Then there was John Major about how he didn't like to cause a fuss and how that imbued the British spirit. There'll be much more of these tributes on Monday when the Commons is recalled for MPs to give their views and recollections on the importance of Prince Philip in the ship of state for the last 70-odd years. But apart from that, politics will be paused for around the next 8 days until the funeral. That means campaigning in the upcoming elections paused, no more ministerial interviews or announcements, as we begin to reflect on an extraordinary life about what public service really means not only to politicians, but to the public themselves.
Sam, thank you very much.
Well, among his royal duties that Prince Philip carried out, he also carried out, of course, many overseas engagements, both with and without the Queen, and hundreds of visits to Commonwealth countries. Well, I'm joined now by Kenya's High Commissioner to the UK, Manoa Esipisu. Mr. Manoa, it's great to talk to you. Thanks so much for joining us. Of course, it was in Kenya, wasn't it, that Prince Philip and the Queen discovered the death of her father and that she was then going to be Queen. And it was a country that they had enjoyed spending time in.
Yes, indeed. It was in the Aberdare in central Kenya that the then Princess Elizabeth that she had become queen. Of course, she was on that trip with the Prince Philip, and she
He was the longest serving consort in history.
Say, well, you're biased, but no, people don't know that I've been there, that I've been under bombs, that my family has lost members of its own, that my children do not have a grandfather because of the Israeli entity, because they killed him right in his village. But this is not the issue here. The issue is to tell the world that there were war crimes, and these war crimes need to be dealt with, and the Palestinians have every right to find protection, to find salvation.
It's Thursday. There was some 60,000 new cases of coronavirus reported. Now, this has been an average for a number of weeks now, and health officials warning that this represents a major threat to the country, in particular as the majority of new cases are that UK variant. Now, this is of great concern to health officials. Any action that will widen the pool of the
talks about the war crimes of Israel itself against the Palestinians. So we're now hearing voices from within the Jewish communities and Israeli entity talking about the massacres committed by their own people. And as well, we are hearing a lot of stories about soldiers who refuse to take part in the Israeli army, who are incarcerated as well.
We're out of time. We're very much out of time. I do apologise for that. Really appreciate you talking to us in Beirut, Marwa Odban. Thank you. That's it for now. Watching the Hawks is next.
To the right or conservative, given the 3 appointments by the previous president. So they're in favor of it, and it's something that, for the most part, conservatives oppose. This, just to give you some context, is something that we really don't know what Joe Biden ultimately thinks about whether or not this is a good idea. All he would say on the campaign trail is that he was willing to set up a commission if he became president. So that's what we're seeing right now. This commission being set up, the White House press secretary saying that he will be listening to a diversity of viewpoints. We know that they will sort of conclude their findings after about 180 days of review, but that they will not be making any recommendations. So it's really a little unclear what's going to happen next.
But can this administration add justices to the Supreme Court if it wanted to? Could it pack the court, as you say?
Technically, yes, it could. What it would do is it would have to encourage Congress to pass a law. And right now, that's something this Democratic White House can do, given the fact that the House of Representatives and the Senate are controlled by Democrats. So, yes, Congress could pass a law and the president could sign it into law, effectively allowing Joe Biden to pack the court, if you will, or increase the number of justices. Just to give you quickly some historical context, though, we haven't seen this since 1869. That's the last time that the number of justices was set at 9, and that's where it's remained.
Percent of the country are actually now fully vaccinated. And while we should be celebrating these numbers and building upon them, Americans, like the good, panicky, social herding creatures that we are, have instead become obsessed with vaccination passports. Voices on both the right and the left of the U.S. political spectrum have raised concerns about the implementation of vaccine passports in day-to-day life and travels. And while many of those concerns have been reasonable and have led to important discussions about the safety of personal medical information being shared and passed around, others come straight from the QAnon Russiagate playbooks of paranoia that we've become so accustomed to. Hoping to quell fears of a New World Order style lockdown through vaccine passports, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki told reporters, quote, "The government is not now, nor will we be supporting a system that requires Americans to carry a credential. There will be no federal vaccination database and no federal mandate requiring everyone to obtain a single vaccination credential." But while the paranoia over vaccine passports may bring more clicks and ratings, one of the more serious vaccine issues facing the world today appears to come from an old place, the fight between the haves and the have.
Money was tight. It was a happy time for Philip, surrounded by his parents and sisters. It wouldn't last. When he was 8, his mother was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia.
His mother was then tragically confined to what was called in those days an asylum for the mentally disturbed. It was the more tragic because Philip was not told what had happened to his mother. She just vanished from his life.
I mean, it's difficult for me to imagine how on earth he coped with the sort of family life that he had. And I think he hugely valued the family life and people coming together and being there for each other.
With his parents separated, he moved around boarding schools in Britain, eventually settling at Gordonston in Scotland.
It turned him into the entirely reliable person that he was. I mean, he learned very early that he had to really stand on his own 2 feet.
As soon as he left school, a career in the Navy was calling. It was while training at Dartmouth Naval College another chapter of his life would open. During a royal visit, he was asked to escort King George VI, his wife and 2 daughters, including Princess Elizabeth.
I think her heart was lost then. Everything is godlike good looking.
He must have been about 18, I think. I did suppose that he fell in love with her. I'm sure he would have very much enjoyed her company and thought she was a rather unusual child for her age. I think it wasn't long before it developed into something rather different.
6 weeks after that visit, Britain would go to war. Philip was first sent to the Indian Ocean and then the Mediterranean, where he'd serve on HMS Valiant. His efforts during the Battle of Cape Matapan against the Italian ships was mentioned in dispatches. Like so many, Elizabeth and Philip would stay in touch during the war by writing letters.
There was quite a lot of correspondence went on, and they probably managed to meet occasionally.
He was a bachelor. Again, remember this is wartime, and you don't know whether you're going to get blown out of the sea the next morning. Adds a certain sort of frisson to the whole of life.
For November the 20th, Lieutenant Mountbatten returns to the Naval Training Centre.
As conflict came to an end, not everyone was happy about Elizabeth's continuing infatuation, most notably her parents.
Queen Elizabeth, I think, wasn't quite sure about this good-looking young man. Also, where was his family? Where'd he gone to school? What was this place, Gordonston? Nobody had heard of it. Prince Philip had joined the Royal Navy. Very good, mentioned in dispatches. But it's not the Brigade of Guards, is it?
But in 1947, their engagement was announced.
To the famous balcony came the bride and bridegroom.
In the gloom of post-war Britain, the wedding was a cause for celebration. The Duke of Edinburgh and his Duchess soon settled into married life. Their first 2 children, Charles and then Anne, were born.
He was a fun parent to have around. and very conscious of spending time with the children when he could. But the more you've known about him and his life, I think the more impressed and the more proud I become of what not only he achieved as an individual, but how he translated that into the rest of his life. And that is an example which I would hope to be able to follow.
Philip continued to rise through the Navy. He was posted in Malta, where his wife would visit, a chance for them to spend time together as a couple.
They're taking the places of the King and Queen who would have gone but for His Majesty's illness.
In 1952, as they were beginning a tour of the Commonwealth, everything changed.
To the stunned heart of London and to the whole Commonwealth came the tragic news from Sandringham of the passing of a beloved sovereign, King George VI.
Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip were in such a remote place in a hunting lodge in Kenya, it was difficult to contact them.
The word came through. It was given initially to the Duke of Edinburgh. Of course, he immediately went to tell his young wife the news that her father, her much-loved father, had died.
A year later came the coronation. His wife was now queen, he was her consort.
Next, the Duke of Edinburgh, preceding the other royal dukes.
She understood the limitations that he willingly took on in his life as a very masculine man, being always one step behind his wife.
And there was no disguising his obvious pleasure at being back amongst his former shipmates.
With his wife settling into her new role, he was forced to give up his career in the Navy. In a rare interview, he talked about how difficult that decision was to make.
I could perfectly well go on with this, with the career. It didn't seem to, and it would have, it seemed to me, would have been of great value to the Queen when she became Queen eventually, to have somebody who was, in a sense, professionally qualified at something, and not just traipsing around.
Outwardly dedicated and seemingly compliant, there was, however, the issue of whether his children would take his name. Windsor won out over Mountbatten.
I don't think she quite realised that it was really going to have a very deep effect on Prince Philip. As he said, I must be the only man in the whole country who was not allowed to pass his name on to his children.
Prince Philip would carve out his own path, travelling across the country and around the world promoting his favoured causes. From British industry,
3 out of every 5 gas turbines flying or on order in the entire Western world are British.
to the environment,
There are exciting opportunities to protect some very significant habitats.
and doing his bit to help young people.
So I wasn't prepared for this. I think we'd better get on with the celebrations now.
Out of the 800 charities he supported, the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme was one of his biggest achievements.
300,000 young people are doing this award at any one time, and what they're getting is this life-changing experience. The Duke's relationship with young people was actually quite a surprising thing. The way in which he engaged with young people when he met with them was extraordinary to see.
Very active, lots of interest, and constantly encouraged us in all sorts, get involved in all sorts of activities, and that's been, that's the bit that we will always remember.
When his wife needed him for overseas tours, garden parties and the big state occasions, he was for decades a constant by her side.
The main lesson that we've learned is that tolerance is the one essential ingredient of any happy marriage. It may not be quite so important when things are going well, but it is absolutely vital when things get difficult. And you can take it from me that the Queen has the quality of tolerance and abundance.
I think particularly for a woman in a role such as she has, I think it would be a very lonely place to be if she didn't have a life partner the way that she has with Prince Philip. And he's a strong character. He's someone she can lean on. He has his own interests as well as the interests of the Queen as well. He sort of has her back, really.
I don't think he got involved in constitutional issues that he shouldn't have got involved in. But for instance, the Christmas broadcast, which was an ordeal for the Queen, the Duke was probably the most important person who she consulted just on the text and the language.
Out of the public eye, he was also someone his 4 children could turn to.
Lots of different members of the family would always find him a good person, a good sounding board. But it was always done very quietly, and he would never talk to anybody else about his conversations.
The family is very close together, and we do enjoy spending time. School will break up in July, and that would be for me the phony holiday, so we go off and do different things. But my parents really weren't really able to escape until August, and that was always really frustrating because we get to Balmoral in sort of mid-August, and it was great fun. But I was only there for about 2 weeks, and then it was off back to school again.
As one by one his children's marriages failed, the 1990s were some of the most testing years. Amid the scandal and divorce proceedings, there was also a fire at Windsor Castle. In 1997, Princess Diana was killed in a car crash. They were criticised for staying in Scotland, keeping the princes away from London. It was hard for the Duke to see his wife under attack.
That's what we've been doing.
Sorry?
That's what we've been doing.
It was, in fact, Prince Philip who encouraged Prince William to walk behind his mother's coffin.
But it was clear that William didn't want to walk behind the coffin, just felt it would be difficult. And he said to Prince William, "You may regret this if you don't walk in the procession in years to come. You may regret not having been there." So Prince Philip said, "If I walk, will you walk with me?"
In those difficult years, he had little time for the press.
Are you well, sir?
Do I look ill?
In an age of increasing political correctness, Philip at times became as well known for his gaffes as his good work, a reputation he wasn't fond of. An outburst at a Battle of Britain event, just one that made the headlines.
Some of the most famous gaffes, this was probably the 1000th person he was shaking hands with that week. He could see that they were stuck and they didn't quite know what to say next, and he was trying to jolly them along.
Many of those closest to him would argue he was full of fun, helping his wife to modernise the monarchy, making them more accessible.
Sometimes on really rather stiff occasions, the people would be lined up in a ghastly long semicircle, and the Queen would go one way, the Duke would go the other, and you'd hear gales of laughter coming from the Duke's side, and that made things better on the Queen's side as well.
Duke Edinburgh always notices the little one who's got a flower that he or she wants to give to the Queen, and there are many photographs and footage of him picking the child up, taking it over the barrier, and then letting the child go and give the flower to the Queen. And he always notices things like that.
It was following the Diamond Jubilee pageant that he was forced into hospital with a bladder infection. This was the Queen's milestone, but also a reminder of the public's affection for her husband.
Ladies and gentlemen, if we